Traditional and contemporary Neapolitan pizza aren't separated by style, they're separated by how the dough is built and managed. Let's look at what actually changes. The differences are not just about the stretching technique or the flour, but it's about the gluten elasticity for those two products. Today, we're breaking down the data from W index to hydration to show you exactly why these two types of pizza behaves differently in the oven. Looking at those two pictures, clearly you can see the main difference visually, and that is the size of the crust. The contemporary Neapolitan pizza has a more pronounced crust. The Neapolitan pizza, on the other hand, has still a crust, but it's smaller and less developed. So in order to properly understand the differences between the contemporary and traditional Neapolitan pizza, we need to look at the differences for gluten elasticity. And when we talk about gluten, we talk about the two elastic properties that define the elasticity of gluten. One is tenacity, the strength and the resistance that the gluten shows, and the extensibility, how easy the gluten is workable. Depending on the product that we realize, we always need to get to the right balance in terms of tenacity and extensibility. It's in fact this balance that allows us to have a product with specific properties in terms of the visual, or in terms of the crust, in terms of the crumb development. So as we saw earlier, there is a big difference in the visual on the crust size between the contemporary and the traditional Neapolitan pizza. And that difference is exactly linked to this gluten elasticity. So in reality, how does this gluten elasticity change between the two pizzas? So when it comes to the extensibility, contemporary and traditional Neapolitan pizza are basically the same. They behave in the same way in the sense that they want to be easy to work with during stretching, and so the gluten has to show a great extensibility. Here I'm giving a score of 3 out of 3. But the main difference between the contemporary and the traditional Neapolitan pizza is, of course, on the tenacity. We have the same extensibility, but it's the tenacity that is changing. In other words, the contemporary Neapolitan pizza can achieve this development of the crust thanks to this higher tenacity. So, contemporary Neapolitan pizza has 1.5 out of 3 tenacity. The traditional Neapolitan pizza still has some tenacity, as otherwise the dough would tear, and this tenacity is just 0.5 out of 3. Understanding the differences in the gluten elasticity between contemporary and traditional pizza confirms that those two pizzas are not just two styles with a mere stretching difference, it's a real different gluten. If you want a structured way to think about dough behavior beyond this comparison, I've put the framework together in a short ebook. The link is just here in the description. So, the data comparison table is here. Let's start with the crust size. For traditional Neapolitan pizza, it's minimal. We still have a crust, to be clear, but we go up to 2 centimeters. For the contemporary Neapolitan pizza, it's more pronounced. It can be even bigger than 2 centimeters. The flour, we have some differences here. The traditional Neapolitan pizza wants to use white flour, as stated in regulation, so type 00 or type 0. We can use up to 20% of semi-whole wheat flour tipo 1, but what's important here to retain is the W index, the strength of the flour. We tend to use a less stronger flour than the contemporary pizza, so between 250 to 320, especially because we want less tenacity. Contemporary Neapolitan pizza uses a stronger flour, as we said, 280 to 330 generally. And as regards the classification, we can use any type of flour. White flour is always preferred. Why is that? Because we can get to that nice level of extensibility. At the same time, we can use certain percentages of whole wheat flour in it. Next, we're going to, of course, talk about hydration. Traditional Neapolitan pizza, it's less hydrated than the contemporary Neapolitan pizza, between 55 and 62.5%. For contemporary Neapolitan pizza, we have a higher hydration. Why is that? It's because we're working with the higher tenacity dough. The flour is stronger. Generally, the protocol and the recipe will give higher tenacity, so we need more water in order to have a more balanced dough. Regarding the dough techniques for preparation, the traditional Neapolitan pizza allows only a direct dough preparation or sourdough up to 10%. For contemporary Neapolitan pizza, we can use whatever we want. Direct approach, indirect preparation method with bigger or Polish or even sourdough. Next, we're looking at the fermentation. A key step in guiding the differences in the gluten elasticity. So for traditional Neapolitan pizza and the contemporary Neapolitan pizza, we're doing a long final proofing. This is the last fermentation before baking, and it's that fermentation that allows us to achieve high extensibility of our gluten. But as we discussed earlier, we have a difference in terms of gluten elasticity, and that is that the contemporary Neapolitan pizza has more tenacity associated with it. And so the elasticity that we need usually comes from the bulk fermentation or a pre-fermented dough like biga or Polish. So we're gonna work the dough during those phases in order to get to a different balance in the gluten elasticity. Next, let's look at baking, another key point that increases the differences between the traditional and contemporary Neapolitan pizza. We saw earlier that the hydration between traditional and contemporary pizza is different, linked to the gluten elasticity difference. So we have a lower hydration for traditional Neapolitan pizza. That means that the pizza is going to cook less time. So baking time is shorter, 60 to 90 seconds, at a higher temperature of 450 to 500 degrees. As we said, for contemporary Neapolitan pizza, we're increasing the hydration. That is a key step in order to balance in the right direction our gluten. And so automatically baking time will be longer, 90 to 120 seconds. The temperature, of course, will decrease 400 to 450 degrees Celsius. This is also an important difference that explains the texture variation that we have going from the traditional Neapolitan pizza to the contemporary one. Traditional Neapolitan pizza, it's mostly soft. The softness comes from this short baking time at high temperature. The moment where we increase the time for the contemporary Neapolitan pizza, we have a crispier effect that starts to appear on the crust. This effect is going to disappear rapidly. Why? Because we still have a short overall baking time, but the few seconds more really helps getting a different texture on the crust for the contemporary Neapolitan pizza. Last point, it's related to the regulation existing for the two types of Neapolitan pizza. The traditional Neapolitan pizza is regulated by a official protocol written by the AVPN, Associazione Verace Pizza Napoletana. This association based in Naples has decided the overall recipe and process to implement the traditional Neapolitan pizza. On the other hand, contemporary Neapolitan pizza doesn't have any regulation, so we can implement a different solution. For me, the most important thing is to respect this baking constraint, because if we cook the pizza longer, it won't be a Neapolitan pizza. In this chapter, we're going to look at some examples of recipe for contemporary and traditional Neapolitan pizza, starting with the contemporary version. You can find this complete recipe in a dedicated video that I realized here on the channel. The link is just in the description. So for this direct recipe for contemporary pizza, I'm using a medium strength flour, an hydration of 70%. The fermentation is split into bulk fermentation for 24 hours in the fridge to give structure and flavor to my dough, and another 24 hours still in the fridge for the final proofing to get that perfect extensibility at the end. The kneading is realized with a spiral mixer, but you can do it by hand or even with a domestic robot. What's important during kneading is to give the right elasticity to the dough, like you can see here. After kneading, just some folding and the dough goes for 24 hours of bulk fermentation. Once again, this is essential for the contemporary Neapolitan pizza to get the right gluten structure. After bulk fermentation, it's time to do the dough ball shaping, and here are the dough balls at the end of final proofing. Once we get to the stretching step, there is an important notion here to share with you. The contemporary dough does not get that developed crust just thanks to the stretching technique. In fact, it's not enough to leave just a few centimeters of dough if that dough is not capable of developing thanks to its elasticity. In other words, it's the combination of the right gluten and the right stretching technique that allows the contemporary Neapolitan pizza to have that developed crust that we like. And here it is, the result after baking. As we discussed, the crust is light, low density, and well developed. And this is thanks to the fact that we get to that right gluten balance that we talked about earlier. By the way, all these videos are an extract of my pizza training that I mentioned to you earlier. All the informations are in the description. Another dough technique used for contemporary Neapolitan pizza is the biga, a pre-fermented dough prepared 18 to 24 hours before kneading. In this case, the biga after kneading rested 24 hours in the fridge. The dough prepared by using biga is called an indirect dough. The biga gives our dough an increased level of tenacity. That helps especially with the crust development. In theory, the dough, which has a higher acidity than the direct method, can have a different flavor profile, even though it can be difficult to feel this difference when eating a thin pizza such as the Neapolitan one, where the toppings have a great impact on the overall pizza taste. Let's now look at the traditional Neapolitan pizza. Here I'm working with a less strong flour and a lower hydration, around 62%. By the end of kneading, you can see that the dough is more compacted than the contemporary version. For this dough, there is no bulk fermentation, as we make the dough balls straight away. This type of fermentation allows us to keep an optimum extensibility level in our dough. After shaping, the dough balls go for 24 hours in the fridge. The final visual aspect is quite different from the contemporary dough, even here. The dough balls are less relaxed and more compacted due to the lower hydration. But the right fermentation management allowed me to get anyway to the right extensibility, as you can see just now. The dough stretches in fact very easily. Here I'm going to use the slap or the schiaffo technique, typical for the traditional Neapolitan pizza. After the toppings and after baking, the visual difference with the contemporary version is even clearer. The adapted flour, hydration and fermentation we did for this version of the Neapolitan pizza gave me a crust that developed less, just like I wanted and expected. So what are my 4 tips when realizing Neapolitan pizza, and especially to realize it properly? So the first one is to choose a medium strength flour. The W index is an important parameter. Choose it correctly. The reason is because that will impact the elasticity at the end of your dough. The dough for Neapolitan pizza shouldn't be too elastic, shouldn't have too much tenacity. And so if you choose a strong flour, you will end up with a dough that is not only more elastic, but also chewier at the texture level. So be careful, be mindful of that. Keep the tenacity under control. We discussed it just now throughout the presentation. The tenacity should be low and we should have more extensibility in our dough. The high tenacity in our Neapolitan pizza dough increases the stretching time, so it makes the dough more difficult to stretch, but also it will impact the lightness of the texture. If you get to that right balance of extensibility and tenacity, you will get to a nice and light dough that will be cooked properly within the 120 seconds. If not, the tenacity will impact the texture. You will have a more that chewy effect on your Neapolitan pizza. When you keep the tenacity under control, you also allowing the dough to be nice and extensible. The third tips for you is to choose a balanced hydration. Where does this come from? It's clear that the trend today is to increase the hydration of a Neapolitan pizza. We see more and more 75, 80% hydration, even more sometimes. So the question has to be asked, what's the logic in a product like Neapolitan pizza that has a very short baking time to increase hydration, when after all, during baking, we need to let all the water evaporate in our dough? The answer is, of course, there is no logic in that. So the point of Neapolitan pizza is to realize the dough has a balanced hydration. As you saw, we can start as low as 55% for the traditional one, but we can go up to 70, 75%. For me, it's really the upper limit. Above that, we have a dough that has too much water, that can have problem during baking, and that will impact the final texture of the dough. So be careful with that. And the last but not least is to ensure a correct baking under 2 minutes. We discussed it throughout the presentation. Baking stage is a critical point for our Neapolitan pizza because the features and the texture of Neapolitan pizza depends upon this baking stage. So if you don't respect this timing, you will not get that soft texture and that flavor of Neapolitan pizza. So I talk about the right combination between time, temperatures, and also dough. The dough needs to be not too much hydrated, as we discussed just now, should have the right extensibility, not too much tenacity, and the temperatures of your oven should always be set so that you allow the dough to be cooked under 2 minutes. Even if you realize a perfect dough for your Neapolitan pizza, but you're using a too high temperature or you're cooking for too short, your Neapolitan pizza won't be good. Those tips will be very helpful, especially if you also have a framework in order to manage your dough. During the process and fermentation, the dough behavior changes, and with it, the gluten elasticity. So if you want a structured way to think about gluten elasticity and how to approach no more problems into a pizza, I've put this framework together in the ebook. The link is just in the description. And if you really want to understand the how and the why of our dough, I put together a playlist of several videos about dough science. You can just find it here in the final part of this video. There is still a lot to cover about dough science, so enjoy watching my videos and see you soon. Ciao!